This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm speaking to you from Helensburgh today. It's about 25 miles northwest of Glasgow and sits on the River Clyde. And it's raining, which at the moment anyway is rather unusual because we've had some cracking weather recently. If you're new to my podcasts, I try to share with you and experience, albeit virtually, the real Scotland, its people, its customs and traditions, and some of the amazing places to visit, and there are many, which include castles, palaces, or the beautiful landscapes amongst the mountains and the glens. What I try to do on these virtual journeys is to share with you all that Scotland has to offer, and if you do intend to visit this wonderful country at some stage in the future perhaps, then your tour may be shaped by some of what you discover here. I'm so pleased to say that I've already had some inquiries about Scottish tours after some listeners got in touch, so please, I remind you again, if you do wish to know anything or have a special tour made, a special podcast, then just get in touch via my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. This podcast is the third in a tour trilogy that will see us take a tour from Loch Ness over to the island of Skye with a tour around the Misty Isle. In my last podcast, we travelled from Portree, the capital of the Isle of Skye, all the way around the peninsula. As we left, we headed north and visited one of the two peninsulas, the Waternish Ridge, as it's called. We saw sights such as the Old Man of Storr, Kilt Rock, Flora MacDonald's resting place, Skye's Museum of Island Life, and rested last night at the Ski Bost Hotel. It was a super trip, and Skye, as one of the most popular islands to visit in Scotland, has not let us down so far. Well, I'm now delighted to take you on the final part of our tour trilogy, to see and hear about a castle belonging to the powerful Macleod clan that's been in the family for over 800 years. You'll hear sad tales of clan battles, and you'll also hear about fairies that were part of 17th century life and are still considered to bring luck to the Macleods today. It's going to be a wonderful trip, so I'd now like you to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy the third part of your Unique Scotland tour from Loch Ness to Skye. If you're at home and enjoying a wee dram, then I raise my glass to you with the traditional Gaelic Scottish toast, Slanjava. Well, after a very comfortable night in the Ski Bost Hotel and a hearty breakfast, we depart, taking the A850 road west towards the Waternish Peninsula. Loch Snizort is visible through the trees on our right-hand side, and suddenly a beautiful plain church comes into view. This is the Snizort Bridge United Free Church of Scotland. It's a relatively plain building, but perfectly positioned to take advantage of the lovely view down Loch Snizort. It was built in 1847 under the supervision of the Very Reverend Roderick Macleod. He also oversaw the church build at Uig. However, he was involved in an incident that rocked the Church of Scotland to its very core. Now, Reverend Roderick Macleod was born on Skye in 1794, and he studied divinity at Aberdeen University. He became a member of the Church of Scotland and worked with his father at Lydale, his father's parish, in 1818. He left the established Church of Scotland during the disruption of 1843 and became a prominent figure of the Free Church, becoming its head, or moderator as it's called, in 1863. I'm often asked, why are there so many churches in Scotland? And one of the reasons is because of this disruption or schism in the church. And this was a bitter nationwide division that split the established Church of Scotland in two. In effect, there was a backlash against the patronage system whereby rich landowners selected local ministers. In 1843, at a general meeting in Edinburgh, about 1/3 of the Church of Scotland ministers walked out and formed the new Free Church, which in their eyes removed the state's encroachment on the spiritual independence of the church. Of course, they needed new premises, so a large number of churches were built for this new order. It's funny that I remember the Free Church when I was a boy, and I remember we went from one to the other, And every Sunday I was given a threepenny piece, which would be basically pennies or dimes in your parlance. But one of the great things as far as I was concerned was that if this is a free church, then I could go into the church and not put my money in the box because it was free, and therefore I could spend my money on sweeties afterwards. And it was many years before I realised exactly what I'd done. Anyway, perhaps more on the establishment of the Free Church of Scotland in a later podcast. And can I just remind you that if you have a particular subject you'd like to hear about, then please do get in touch through my website. I should say we are now getting back onto a twin-track road, so the going is easier after the single-track road around the Waternish Ridge. We pass Loch Trelane on the right-hand side, which is effectively an offshoot of Loch Snizort, and as we pass I see Auchendenny Guesthouse, where I stayed a number of years ago. A lovely location, right on the loch, and a treat of a view when you're having your breakfast. Well, we continue heading north, and Loch Grishornish comes into view. It's another sea loch leading from Loch Snizort, and we're now passing through typical settlements or hamlets that are scattered around Skye. It's always interesting to note the names of these settlements to discover whether they have Norse or Gaelic origin. And by the way, Norse is just simply a Viking that stopped raping, pillaging and killing and settled down. Anyway, the first couple of settlements we arrive at are Sullidale, which means the Dale of the Pillar, and Trelane, which means battle enclosure. Now they both originate from the Norse language, but as we continue on, we come to the settlements of Flashadder, which is flat pasture or shieling, and Edinbane, the white face or slope, and they both originate from the Gaelic language. This happens all over the island, and although the Norse lost these islands in the late 13th century, the influence of that culture still lingers on. We continue west, and the landscape is a fairly flat, heather-strewn heath with horned, black-faced sheep grazing everywhere. About 3 miles before the settlement of Dunvegan, there's a road to the right, which we take to gain access to the heart of the Waternish Peninsula. Well, we only drive a few hundred yards. Then, on the left-hand side is a lay-by, which is a pull-in by the side of the main road. And there's an old single-arch stone-built bridge, which is known locally as the Fairy Bridge, and that has a connection with the fairy flag that we'll be seeing when we visit Dunvegan Castle. The bridge takes its name from a local fairy legend dating to when Clan Macleod of Dunvegan ruled this whole area, a clan whose legends frequently included fairies. Well, legend has it that a clan chieftain had married a fairy, but she could only stay with him for 20 years in a mortal state. At the end of the 20 years she brought him to the bridge, where she would depart once more to the fairy land. Well, before she went, she handed him a fairy flag, which became the clan's good luck charm. On giving him the flag or banner, she told him that if he was ever hard-pressed in battle, then waving it would bring a host of armed men to his side. Well, there is most certainly a fairy flag that we'll see in the castle, but how it came into the Macleod's hands is not known exactly, and there are other versions of this legend, but more of that when we visit the castle. I suppose it's worth mentioning that Skye's incredible landscape of scenic hills, grassy knolls, ruined castles, mysterious pool and rock formations do make it an ideal location for fairy folklore, and some of the locations look like the sort of place that fairies would gather, and local legends do bring it to life. And we'll be seeing some of those on our journey as well. Well, we get back on the road and head further north up the Waternish Peninsula to see one church in particular, Trumpan Church, with a very sad and bloody history. We pass by the settlements of Luster and Stein, and at Stein we turn right and find an amazing tannery of all things, and stop for a cup of coffee in their delightful outdoor cafe that looks right out onto the waters of the Minch and the Outer Hebrides. Well, Skye Skins, as it's called, was established in 1983 and is the sole remaining commercial woolskin tannery in Scotland. It was created by the Hartwell family and produces superb quality handcrafted sheepskins, leather and woolen goods, and it's definitely a place to stop for a visit to a tannery if you've never visited one, and it's certainly got a good cup of tea. The road up to Trumpan has some fabulous views over to the Outer Hebrides on our left-hand side, and on the right is a small rising hill, the side of which is covered in blooming purple heather. It's an extraordinary sight. We continue on and the road seems to narrow and its surface is more uneven. You can really tell that we're getting away from the main area of population, and there's probably less need for more regularly repaired road surfaces. The view, however, is spectacular, and it's a joy to continue to the end of this particular trek. At a small settlement called Lower Halistra, there's a fork in the road, and we take the left fork to continue following the sea on our left-hand side. We pass some lovely original Skye cottages of the late 18th century with slate roofs rather than the thatch that was so prevalent in the past. We finally reach the end of the loop and turn right to start coming back on ourselves, and the road begins to climb. As we get to the top of the rise, the ruins of Trumpan Church come into view, and knowing the story of what happened here always makes me shudder slightly. So let me tell you a story of clan rivalry between the Macleods and Macdonalds, one of their bloody battles and savagery which still reverberates down the centuries. Before I describe the terribly sad events which led to the ruin of Trumpan Church and a massacre of Macleods on Sunday in 1578, I need to tell you of an appalling massacre a year earlier when some Macleod men were visiting the island of Eigg, a Macdonald stronghold in those days. And if you're looking for Eigg on a map, it's about 10 miles south or 16 kilometres south of Skye's Slate Peninsula. Well, the story of Eigg was that some of the visiting Macleods became too amorous with local Macdonald women and were taken aside, bound and set adrift in a boat from the island. To reap revenge, the Macleods arrived in force in the spring of 1577 and sought out the islanders. Having seen the Macleods approaching, the islanders hid in a cave known as the Cave of St. Francis, which is down a steep bank and onto the shore. There's a small waterfall and foliage covering the entrance, so it's not easy to find. However, the Macleods did find the Macdonald Islanders in the cave, and set fire to thatch and brushwood taken from nearby cottages, and every man, woman and child suffocated. And it wasn't until the 19th century that all the bones were gathered from the cave and given an appropriate burial. I tell you this to put into perspective the events of the following year, when the Macdonalds from the island of Uist, in seeking revenge, landed on the beach just down from where we are now at Trumpan Church. It was a Sunday, and they knew the church would be full. And when they arrived, they barred the doors and set fire to the church. Apparently the screams were drowned out by a Macdonald piper walking around the graveyard. All died except one young woman who was able to raise the alarm. Well, having been informed by this young woman, a group of Macleod men then came over from Dunvegan to try to stop the Macleods from escaping, and as it happens, they caught them on the beach trying to leave, but their boats were left high and dry on an ebbing tide. The battle that ensued was a massacre of Macdonalds, and their bodies were dragged up to a nearby wall, or dyke in Gaelic, and buried under the stones, and the battle still known to this day as the Battle of the Spoiling Dyke. Well, I visited the St. Francis Cave on Eigg, and although the entrance is large enough for easy entry, to get right inside you've got to crawl through a narrow gap until you can reach a cavern beyond. It's a very eerie place, and it was easy to see how lighting a fire would have suffocated those inside so easily. Trumpan Church ruin is similarly eerie, and one can only wonder what those poor souls trapped inside must have gone through. Now, I've spoken in previous podcasts about clan warfare, but it takes a lot to beat this unadulterated murder on the parts of both clans. And you might not be surprised to hear I'll be telling you of other battles when I cover Scottish clans in later podcasts. Well, we've come as far up the Waternish Peninsula as we can by car, and we make our way back to the original junction where we pass the ferry bridge once more on the right-hand side. We actually turn right at this junction and head towards the small village of Dunvegan and the magnificent Dunvegan Castle. Before we get to Dunvegan, about half a mile from the village is the ruin of St Mary's Old Church, dating from about 1694. It's a rectangular shape, roughly built of stones or boulders, and is reminiscent of other post-Reformation churches in Skye. It's surrounded by a dry stone dyke or a stone wall without cement, enclosing an ancient cemetery. Now, some Macleod chiefs are buried here, and you'll also see headstones for generations of Macrimans, who were hereditary pipers to the Macleods. It is a real reminder of the past, and is a good introduction to Dunvegan as we head to the castle and stronghold of the Macleods. We enter the small settlement of Dunvegan and take the right fork towards Dunvegan Castle. 2 miles later, we arrive at a large car park, deposit the car, and head for the imposing gated entry to the castle grounds. It takes about 5 minutes to walk down the driveway to a point that gives a great view of Dunvegan Castle, which seems to sprawl on top of a rocky outcrop, surrounded by beautifully maintained gardens. This magnificent structure, or series of structures, as there have been so many additions since the first tower was built, has been the seat of Clan Macleod since the 13th century. Amazing to think that this stronghold has been in the family of the clan chiefs of Macleod for nearly 800 years. The present chief, Hugh Macleod of Macleod, is the 30th in the line. Now, before telling you about the castle, where does the name Macleod come from? Well, I've mentioned in my previous podcast on Scotland the people that Mac in Gaelic means son of. So Macleod is Macleod, or son of Leod, who was believed to be a son of Olaf the Black, a 13th century king of the Isles. Now, Olaf the Black was of Viking origin, and he ruled the Western Isles from the 9th to the 13th century. So the Macleods are from the hardy and warring Viking stock, possibly one of the reasons that they had the determination to hold on to this stronghold throughout history. Indeed, their motto is Hold Fast, with a bull motive in the centre of their clan shield. And when you look at the castle itself, it's holding fast onto a huge rock, 175 feet high, which used to be surrounded by sea. The sea has receded, but to get into the castle, you still have to cross a bridge. And before you enter, it's worth just looking at the building in front of you in more detail. It's actually a number of buildings, and some parts go back to the 13th century. The first main building off to the right was the keep or tower house, and that was constructed in the 14th century. Off to the left, away from the keep, was the Fairy Tower, and that's built in the 16th century. Then a building in the middle, almost joining the tower with the keep, was built in the 17th century, and that's called Rory Moore's Tower. But the entry point, which does connect the two towers, is the front hall, and that was constructed in the 19th century and gives a uniformity to the castle as you approach it. In the 1840s, the castle was given a romantic restoration by the 25th chief, who had defensive battlement and Victorian dummy pepper pots installed to give it a unified design. This remodelling happened to a few other castles in Scotland to give them a more authentic look that displayed the rugged and difficult times of their medieval past. Well, as you enter the main hall, you immediately climb a steep staircase and turn left into Rory Moore's house, which was probably built as accommodation when the original tower was becoming too small. The next building you enter is the Fairy Tower, and you can tell its age by the depth of the doorway, which can be between 6 to 9 feet thick, almost 2 to 3 metres. And that's the original thickness of the outer castle wall to give it the considerable strength it needed to belay any attackers. But the room that I want to discuss in this fortress is the drawing room, which retains the actual fairy flag. Hanging in a frame on one of the seaward-facing walls, the fairy flag presents itself to visitors. It's a very frail-looking piece of fabric with many holes and has clearly been in the wars. But it is a treasured item in Clan Macleod history and takes pride of place in this castle. The flag itself is made of silk, is yellowish-brown and is about 20 square inches or 48 square centimetres. It has been examined at length on a number of occasions in the past and is believed to originate from the Far East and may be an important relic of some sort. It may even be connected to the Crusades and could have been a banner taken from a vanquished foe. Well, you can tell from what I'm saying, nobody really knows, and this adds to the mystery of the fairy flag. I mentioned earlier when we visited the Fairy Bridge, the legend of the fairy, having been married to the Macleod chief for 20 years, and who then had to return to fairyland. She gave the chief this flag with the promise that if it was ever unfurled in battle, then many more warriors would flock to the side of the chief. Now, there are other legends, but this is one that I particularly like because in every legend, no matter how far-fetched, there is usually some grain of truth in the story that's been handed down over the centuries, especially if there's a living artefact to back up that story. And if you look back at battles in recent history, there are flags or musical instruments, such as the bagpipes, that raise the spirits of the men, get the adrenaline flowing, which then allows them to achieve extraordinary feats when defeat seemed inevitable. So, the legend may not be so far-fetched as it sounds. With the Macleod clan warriors, convinced of the flag's magical powers, on seeing it unfurled, they may have been spurred on to such an extent that it appeared, to anyone watching, that the ranks of the Macleod clan had swollen or increased dramatically, allowing them to defeat their enemies. I now want to turn to the other artefacts in the castle, and this time it's some property that once belonged to Flora MacDonald, who was the saviour of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and I talked about her in my last podcast. We visited her grave at Kilmuir, and I gave you an overview of her life. If you remember, she married a MacDonald of Kingsborough, so it's a little bit surprising to see artefacts of hers in the castle of Clan Macleod, when the MacDonalds and the Macleods were sworn enemies. Well, as it happens, her daughter had married the tutor of a clan chief, himself a Macleod, and lived in the castle for some time. Now, when Flora returned from America after the War of Independence, she also lived in the castle with her daughter, and eventually left these relics that we see on display today. They include a lock of Prince Charles's hair, a pincushion with the names of those who suffered during the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, and a small portrait of herself. Well, it's there I must leave the stories of the Macleods for the time being. The castle is really a fascinating place to visit, and I've really just scratched the surface. So, if you're visiting, I would strongly recommend Dunvegan Castle to be on any itinerary. I may even return to Dunvegan Castle myself on my future podcasts on castles. Before we leave the castle, however, we just have to visit the beautiful gardens around the castle. The first garden you encounter is the Water Garden, with an ornate bridge with an amazing waterfall at the far end. There are 5 acres of formal garden which began in the 18th century, containing a water garden, a rose garden, walled garden and a woodland walk with a mix of flowers, exotic plants and specimen trees. The wall garden is well worth a visit. Its original function was to provide food for the chief and his family. Today there is a diverse range of plants and flowers, as well as a lily pond and some fascinating sculptures. Well, it's sad to leave, but we have a schedule to keep and time stands still for no man. So we drive back to the village of Dunvegan, and before we leave the village, there's a quaint straw-thatched cottage on the left-hand side. This is actually a museum, and is dedicated to a man called Angus MacAskill, one of the tallest men ever at 7 feet 9 inches, or 2.36 metres. He was born in the Outer Hebrides, but his family emigrated during the clearances to Canada, where he was brought up and remained for the rest of his life. His life was quite extraordinary, and it is known that he met Queen Victoria for his size and feats of strength. He also performed in a circus with Uncle Tom Thumb, the smallest man in the world. This museum was established in 1989 by a local man, Peter MacAskill, to provide a lasting memorial to a notable member of the clan MacAskill. By the way, there's also a museum to the giant MacAskill in Nova Scotia, and if you're living there and you know of it, please drop me a line and let me know. Well, as we drive away from Dunvegan and before we head south, there's a road on the right-hand side with a sign saying Neast Point and Colbost. This is a narrow, single-track road, and if you went to the end, you would arrive at the sea cliffs at Dunvegan Head. But we will only be going as far as Colbost to visit one of the best-known restaurants, and with some beautiful accommodation, on the Isle of Skye, and well beyond. It is the Three Chimneys, and to find an exquisite restaurant of this quality in such a remote place is tantamount to its culinary success. It was started around 1985 by Eddie and Shirley Spear, and has won numerous awards, including being named as one of the New York food critic Frank Bruni's top 5 favourite restaurants. Anyway, the nice thing about being with me on my virtual tours is that we're going to stop and enjoy a fabulous lunch in sumptuous surroundings and beautiful views from the restaurant. Before we head south once more, we'll drive on just for a couple of miles to see a famous memorial to the Glendale Martyrs in the centre of that settlement. It represents 5 crofters, who are small farmers, who sought and achieved land reform in the late 18th century. It revolved around land shortage which 40 years earlier had been subdivided amongst the population, leaving little for families to work and survive on the land. Led by a man named John Macpherson, the crofters demanded the return of common grazing land that had been taken from them. Well, with no resolution in sight, and without permission being granted, the men began grazing their cattle on the common grazing. Well, court orders for the removal led to a gunboat being sent to Skye to settle the matter, and although the 5 main protagonists spent a couple of months in jail, their action helped towards the setting up of a commission, known as the Napier Commission, to investigate crofters' grievances, and led to the far-reaching and beneficial Crofters Act of 1886. This road also leads down to Neast Point Lighthouse, and on a good day is a super place to visit walk along the cliffs and down to the lighthouse. Well, now continuing south and just past Roskill, which keeps the sea on our right-hand side, we can see in the distance some rather strange flat-top mountains. As spectacular as any tabletop mountain of South Africa, albeit a wee bit smaller. Well, these are known as Macleod's Tables, and formed as a result of the land slippage which I talked about in the last podcast, leaving a flat plateau on top. Well, there's a lovely story of a Macleod Clan Chief who visited the court of James V in Edinburgh, where the lowlanders boasted about their finery and splendour, and with candelabras and spacious halls and beautifully decked tables. Well, Macleod countered this by saying that he had as good, if not better, in the Isle of Skye. Well, one courtier said that he'd believe it when he saw it, and, taking up the challenge, the chief invited this gentleman to Skye. Well, when he arrived, he discovered that dinner that evening was actually on Macleod's table, on top of the mountain. Tables full of food, drink, and starry sky overhead, with scores of clansmen holding torches and a piper playing in the background. Well, he'd proved his point, and the courtier agreed that things were indeed better on Skye. Well, as we continue south, there are a number of fabulous viewpoints along the coast that look out onto the water called the Minch, with the Atlantic beyond. We finally arrive at a turning to the right towards a settlement called Carbost, and we notice the signpost for Talisker Distillery, which used to be the only distillery on the island in recent times. There is a second distillery now on Skye, the Dunvegan, opened in 2017, and you can find that down near the south of the island at Armadale, and I'll probably visit that one of my future podcasts on whisky. Our drive down to Carbost takes us down onto the loch side of Loch Harport, with beautiful scenery beyond. The distillery sits not far from the water's edge and seems well settled in this place, mind you, as it should, having been here almost 200 years. Well, I do like whisky, and I have my favourites, but in the end, if Talisker is good enough for James Bond and M, then it's good enough for me. Now, I'm talking to those of you who have seen the Bond movies The World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day, where James is seen drinking Talisker on several occasions, as is his boss M. Indeed, there's a bottle of Talisker on M's desk in Die Another Day. Anyway, enough reminiscing about great films. Let's talk about this distillery. Well, Talisker Distillery was founded in 1830 by Hugh and Kenneth McCaskill. The distillery was rebuilt in 1880 and extended in 1900. However, it had to be rebuilt again in 1960 after a fire completely destroyed it. Well, inside there are 5 stills. There's 2 wash stills and 3 spirit stills. And don't worry if you don't understand the technology, as I'll be going into the technical details of distilleries in my next week's podcast on whisky. It's going to be the first in a series of podcasts that I'm going to do on whisky over the coming months. And like all things in life, a particular whisky will impress you or not. I like Talisker, but I won't try to impress you with what it is that I like about it. I'm going to be asking a whisky connoisseur to join us in one of my future series on whisky, so I'll let him give you a better idea as to what makes a good whisky. So watch this space. In Talisker's case, they have evidence of how good they can be. In 2007, Talisker 18-year-old won the best single malt in the world. And in 2015, the Talisker 10-year-old won a double gold medal at the best single malt Scotch whisky of up to 12 years old category. Great accolades for a great whisky. Another accolade is that Talisker was the favourite of one of Scotland's famous writers, and certainly one of my favourites, Robert Louis Stevenson. So they must be doing something right. Well, we leave Carbost and continue south for a mile and arrive at the settlement of Mercadale, where we find a turning to the right towards Glen Brittle. Now, I remember this as the place of one of the bloodiest battles between the Macleods and Macdonalds, after which the Scottish king became involved in getting both clans to sign what is known today as a non-aggression pact. Now, I believe this was successful, and the next meeting of the clans was one of the largest and noisiest peace parties the island had ever seen. And maybe a little whisky was drunk on that occasion too. But that battle is for another day. My focus on Glen Brittle today is the fairy pools. I mentioned them in my last podcast, Skye 2, where I said that if you walk through the mountains from Sligachan, then you would pass them on the way. Well, we will pop down to see them, and first we have to drive down a tiny single-track road for about 7 miles, until we come to the car park for the pools. In the summer, it's not easy to get parked in the limited space available, but as I record this, there is some improvement work going on to extend the facilities. The first thing you notice are the extraordinary black Cullin mountains towering over the pools in the distance. Across the road there is a clear path which you have to use to get there and back. The first main waterfall and pool is about 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometres, and with no stops would take about 40 minutes on a gravel path bordered with grass, heather, peat and rocks. However, most people will spend time at the first pool and go on to see more, and also there's so many photographic opportunities that at least 1.5 hours should be set aside for this visit. What we find are beautifully clear, crystal blue pools on the River Brittle. Many tributaries run down from the Cullin Mountains into the glen, forming waterfalls that make up the pools. Wild swimmers have been known to swim in the icy waters, but it's not really advisable without a wetsuit. They are really lovely, and it's easy to find a solitary spot to sit and completely forget the issues of the day, with the sound of the running water in the background, and in such a wonderful surrounding, easing the stress and relaxing the mind. Well, after this complete escape from reality, we have to return, and we soon get back on the road and continue south on our journey and find ourselves back at the junction where the Sligacan Hotel meets the main road heading south towards our destination that night near Armadale. All the places that I mentioned in my last podcast, Skye 2, we pass on our journey south. Loch Sligacan, Loch Snizort, until we arrive at Broadford, and just beyond there is a junction to the right. If we continued on, we'd be heading for the Skye Bridge again that we came across in Skye 1. But we'll take the road to the right, and where we'll find the ferry terminal, because I believe it's always fun to come onto the island by one method and leave via another. Having said that, there is a third method of coming onto or leaving the island, and that's via a small turntable ferry, the Glenahulish, at Calrea, which crosses to Glenelg on the mainland. It's an absolute peach of a ferry and only takes 6 cars, but the joy of taking this small boat is that you have to go over the mountains on both sides to get to it, and on a clear day you can see for miles. The Glenahulish is the last manually operated turntable ferry in Scotland. Sounds bizarre, but it doesn't have the normal ramp at the front or rear as a normal ferry would have. This boat actually arrives alongside, and the crew turn the deck around manually 90 degrees until it reaches the jetty, and then a smaller ramp is put onto the jetty for the cars to enter or exit. It really is part of Skye's heritage. There has been a car ferry operating here since 1934, but this, as the closest point between the island and the mainland, has been a crossing point for hundreds of years. Easy to understand as it's only 600 yards across, or 550 metres. Well, the shadows are getting longer, and we're on the home straight to our lodgings this evening. We are now on the Slate Peninsula, which is known as the Garden of Skye. It's home to Clan MacDonald of Slate, and the name is from Old Norse meaning smooth or even. And this neatly describes the area because, compared with the northern area of Skye and the mountains of the Cullins, Slate is relatively flat. A place I love to visit on the way down the peninsula is Isle of Skye. It's a picturesque little harbour with a great hotel and pub called the Éilinn Arman. It was built in the 19th century, where apparently Flora MacDonald was taken captive after helping Bonnie Prince Charlie evade capture from the government troops after the Battle of Culloden. It's great to sit outside, enjoy a beer with views over the Sound of Slate and the distant hills of Knoydart. The hotel restaurant is excellent, and the pub bar to the side of the hotel, the Am Prabin Bar, has open fires and traditional live music. While back on the road and heading down to Armadale, we pass a very old and difficult to distinguish ruined castle called Knock Castle. It's an old 15th century keep with only one wall remaining at any height. It was constructed by the Macleods, but finally claimed by the MacDonalds after one of their many battles. By 1689, the castle was abandoned, and it's obvious that much of the stone went to build local buildings. It's also claimed that the castle is haunted by a green lady, which is a ghost associated with the fortunes of the family who occupied the castle. After another 10 minutes, we arrive at Armadale Castle, next to the ferry terminal that crosses over to the mainland and the fishing village of Mallig. The castle itself is a ruined country house and former home of the MacDonalds. There was a previous mansion from the 1790s, but what was left of it was incorporated into the new castle. It dates from 1815 and is in the Scottish baronial style, which is a sort of mock castle style. Well, in 1925 the castle was abandoned by the MacDonald family and has fallen into ruin. The wonderful thing about the castle now is that it's become a romantic ruin in the midst of beautifully maintained gardens. And within the garden you'll find the Clan Donald Centre, which operates as the Museum of the Isles. Well, it's great just to wander through the sheltered gardens with the advantage of the Gulf Stream keeping the area nicely temperate at most times of the year. With the temperatures seldom falling below zero, the gardens produce a floral display of varying beauty. There's fabulous trees, some of which are over 100 years old, and they tower above the orchids and wildflowers in spring and summer. You can just have a gentle stroll or sit and relax in an atmosphere of calm and beauty. And turning to the museum, it's easy to navigate with 6 interconnecting galleries that take you through 1500 years of history and culture in an area once known as the Kingdom of the Isles. I'll be covering the story of the powerful MacDonald clan, who are the Lords of the Isles, and their seat of power was on the island of Islay, and I'll cover that island as well. Well, after a very pleasant afternoon in such wonderful surroundings, it's time to book into our accommodation for the night, and that will be at the fabulous Kinloch Lodge, about 10 minutes back along the road we came. Kinloch Lodge is a gem of a family-run country house hotel. It has a 3 AA Rosette restaurant to die for, with the renowned Marcel Tully as the head chef. The hotel is a 16th century former hunting lodge of the MacDonald family and sits on the shores of Loch Nadal, and that's what makes it special as well. The location is superb, and there's so much to do. Well, we'll book into one of the sea view rooms and look forward to dinner this evening. Well, we've come to the end of our tour of Skye in this Skye number 3 podcast. In a future tour we will take the ferry to Malig and then onto the steam train called the Jacobite Express, or the Harry Potter Express, as this was the train that was used in the Harry Potter film. So do look out for my podcast on touring from Skye down to Oban. Well, it's been a great trip, and I've enjoyed showing you around the island over the last 3 days. We started at Loch Ness and made our way onto the island with an overnight stay at Portree, the island's capital. Then onto the Waternish Peninsula to see the Old Man of Storr, Kilt Rock and Flora MacDonald's resting place. Today's visit, having left Skibost Hotel, was to visit Trumpan Church and the Waternish Peninsula. We saw Dunvegan Castle, the fairy pools, and overall we've covered a lot of ground, so I hope you've enjoyed the journey. And if you did miss the first 2 podcasts, please find them on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. My next podcast is going to be on whisky, how it's made, what are the regions of Scotland, what's the difference between a Highland and a Lowland whisky, what's the quake and who are the masters of the quake, and what's the difference between a single malt and a blended whisky, and what can you put into a whisky and what should you definitely not put into a whisky. All this will be revealed in my next podcast next week, and further details can be found on my website at exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. Before I go, I just want to remind you that photographs of many of the places that I mention in all of my podcasts can be seen on the website. I visited all the places I talk about, so it's great that you can share my experience. Also, please get in touch if there's any other subject you'd like me to cover, and thank you to those who have already emailed me. Well, I must sign off, so this is John Robert Mackay Harbour of Unique Scotland saying goodbye. And as we've been talking about whisky, I'd like to raise my glass to you, wherever you are, and give you the Gaelic toast, Slán Java.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive scottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.